I want you to think about a billboard that you've seen along the side of the road at some point. I want you to think about a TV commercial, maybe something that you saw during the Super Bowl or during your favorite show, or some form of advertisement, newspaper, magazine, anything online that has caught your eye. And I want you to think about why it captured your attention and how it captured your attention. See, it's this whole idea of attention that is so hard to get these days. But when we've got it, then all of a sudden we have this direct connection to the brains of the people that we want to talk to. And of course, for a lot of us in classrooms, those people that we want to talk to are our students. And so that's why I think student engagement is so important. Because whenever we have our students' attention, then all of a sudden they can focus in on what it is that we're going to learn and we can get somewhere. If that attention is somewhere else, the students might as well be somewhere else. And so anything that we can do, I think, to engage our students, to reach our students where they are, and to draw them into what we're going to do is huge and super, super important. And so this is step 2 in our Path to Solid Techie lessons, this 5-step framework. And we already talked about step 1, which was learn, and finding that, yes, the standards are part of it, but there's a lot more that we want students to learn by being a part of our class. And so getting the learning in as the foundation is key. But then I found that the engagement piece is the next most important part. See, for a little while, I used to think that you get the learning part in place and then you get the tech next. And see, I think the more that you do this, the more that you start to put these pieces together sort of organically without thinking of them 1, 2, 3 in this order. But as you start to set that framework up in your mind, I've tried to put technology next in order and then done the engagement afterwards. And I've really struggled with that. If that works for you, that's great. But I put engage right after learn, and I put it before tech on purpose. And here's why. I think that getting our students' attention, finding way, and it's not just like, oh, hey, look at this, and trying to superficially try to make them look. This is like hooking their interests in, like the true meaning of engagement, like getting them to lock in on what we're doing. I think that is super crucial. And I think that if we can figure out how we want to do that, we can use the technology to help do that. I think there's a common misconception sometimes that we think, oh, well, kids like technology, and so the technology can be the engaging piece. If that works, it's not sustainable. It's not something that we can count on over and over and over again. Now, we can use the technology to help us get to our goals. But I think that getting the learning in place and then figuring out how we're going to hook students in, how we're going to make it relevant to them, how we're going to make it important to them so that they will stay engaged and that they will see the value in it. That's super important. And so the key question that goes along with this one is, how will it capture students' attention? And I think there are lots of different ways to capture students' attention. So that's what we're going to dig into in this video. So I want to give you a couple of ideas. And there are obviously lots of different ways to do this. So for one, I think we can surprise students, just simply catch them off guard. It's so easy for class to become a place that we come to day after day after day after day, and it starts to feel the same over and over again. In fact, at one point in my teaching career, I was doing the same 4-day cycle where I would do one thing on the first day, another thing on the second day, something on the third day, something on the fourth day, and then we would go back to it. And that little short 4-day cycle over and over and over again, I eventually had kids come to me and say, Mr. Miller, I feel like we're stuck in a rut. It's kind of like the same thing over and over again. And so whenever I would catch them off guard and surprise them, and that could be something big, like an entire different direction that you take for that day's lesson, or an entire project. It could be something small too. Something like having the desks arranged in a different way. You know that whenever kids show up and desks aren't arranged the same way, they don't know exactly where to go, and it totally catches them off guard, right? It could be the way that you arrange the room. It could be something to do with the lighting or props or different things that are in the room. Any of that stuff. It could be costume or props that you use. It could be, any number of things really. But if you start to think about that surprise factor, like what is going to make them go when they walk in the room, that can be huge. Here's another one. How about interests? What they're into. And sometimes all this takes is just a listening ear and a curious mind. So if you're willing to listen to students, to talk about what they're excited about, to talk about what has their attention, what's buzzworthy right now, and you start to ask yourself, can that fit in with step one, learn? Can that connect somehow to what it is that we want to learn to amplify learning? And so that might be the apps that they're into, the YouTubers that they're watching, the sneakers that they're interested in buying, any of that stuff. It could be things at school. It could be extracurricular activities. It could be clubs or sports or whatever. Any of that stuff I think totally fits. One thing that I'm starting to learn a little bit more about is culturally responsive teaching. And I don't know a whole lot about it, but I'm starting to grasp the beginnings of it. And if you're watching this and you know more than me, then I'm glad that there are teachers that do. But I'm starting to see that this engage piece really fits with culturally responsive teaching too. Because what culturally responsive teaching in general talks about is that we're able to reflect the cultures of the students that are in our classroom, so that they feel seen and they feel heard. And so I mentioned this along with interests, because sometimes what our students are interested in, and in addition, what they experience at home, what their cultures are, what their values are, all of that sort of plays into interests some too. Whenever they see that stuff show up in class, all of a sudden they feel seen, they feel heard, they feel understood, they feel validated. And whenever you do that, that's a way to reach some of those students that are harder to reach sometimes. And so, this is definitely one important reason why engage is a big piece of the lesson planning process. Let's go on to the next one. That one is the draw. Now, I didn't come up with this was the best name that I could come up for this one. But what the draw is what's inherently interesting about something. So, there is some reason that we're teaching whatever it is that we're teaching. And if you decided that you wanted to teach it, there's probably a reason that you got into that. If you're teaching math, if you're teaching history, if you're teaching health, there's probably a reason that drew you into that particular topic. And so if you can figure out what that draw is, then you can really double down on it. Let me give you an example. So for instance, if you're teaching literature, there's a chance that you might cover Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. And what is the inherent draw in Julius Caesar? Well, there's lots of things, but one of the big ones, it's about betrayal. It's about Caesar being betrayed. And so when you start to dig into that, you realize that everybody has probably been betrayed in some way, shape, or form. It's kind of a sadly universal thing. Now, you don't want to dig too deep into this because you don't want to draw up past trauma within students, but it is an opportunity to talk about something that everybody's been through. And it's also an opportunity to go back to number one, learn and talk about some of the real life things and some of the mission things for yourself. So you might be able to talk about, what happens when you're betrayed? How can you handle it? How can you make sure that you're not betraying others? And of course, tying all of that into the content the whole way. But by identifying what that one exceptionally compelling part of the content is, whenever you really double down on that, that's a way to get more engagement. There's also pop culture. We talked about this a little bit in interests. I guess the interests are what your students are into. Pop culture is like what society is into right now. So, keeping your eye on, what they're talking about on TV, on YouTube, on social media, trending hashtags, stuff like that. If any of that can play into your lessons, that's a way to engage students too. And then finally, the last one I wanted to mention is playing to the senses, playing to what students take in through sight, smell, hearing, taste, touch, all of those things. There is research that talks about the power of connecting senses to memory. I've seen it especially with smell. Whenever you get a scent connected to a certain memory. For instance, whenever my wife and I went on our honeymoon, we were at a place where the custodial staff used this citrus smelling cleaner. So whenever I smell something that's citrusy, orangey like that, it takes me right back to that immediately. So if there's this strong bond in long-term memory with senses, then maybe there's something that we can play to there. It's definitely something that's very vivid in the brain. So if we want to engage students, there are lots of ways to do it, but these are just a handful of them that you might kind of play around with. How can you surprise them? How can you play to their interests? What's the inherent draw that draws people in? What's popular in pop culture? And how can you play to those 5 senses? So we've covered learn and we've covered engage to this point. And now we're going to finally move on to the tech. We're going to figure out how technology can amplify the teaching and learning that we do in the classroom.